I'm Travis Frame, and this is Frame by Frame, and today is going to be the fourth episode of my analysis series. This one's going to be talking a lot about the symbolism. So, in terms of spoilers, all three will have major spoilers because it's pretty difficult, if not impossible, to talk about the deeper symbolic meaning of a film without talking about some of the stuff that happens in the plot. So, that being said, I'm going to go into the video. Hopefully, everyone enjoys. In this video, I'll be talking about some of the important symbolism. If you know me, you know how big into symbolism I am. I love my movies with good symbolism and good underlying meanings and messages and stuff like that. So these underlying meanings aren't as fun. In fact, they're quite the opposite. But I do think that they add a lot to the films. So within each of these three, Lars von Trier utilizes symbolism in order to convey the ideas that he's presenting and uses them to show the larger message of the films. Each of the films has varying levels of symbolism, and this is used in order to tell the story in a very different way between each of the three. Obviously, some of them will have a lot of symbolism, some will have a little bit. And these are just my interpretations of the symbolism. These are looking and reading and watching what I have been able to gather, what I think is the meaning that von Trier is trying to get across. So Antichrist is the first of the trilogy and is, in my opinion, the most symbolic of the group as well. The film is highly metaphorical with the aspects of depression that it covers, although it is still very direct with its message about depression. But I think that the symbolism adds many, many layers to this film. One of the most immediate symbols that the viewer is introduced to is that of the three beggars, the fox, the deer, and the crow, which symbolize the three beggars of whom represent something else. The fox represents pain, the crow represents despair, and the deer represents grief. The fox is seen as injured and, when confronted, speaks to he and says simply, chaos reigns. My interpretation of the communication is that when in a state of depression, the chaos of pain is filling you. The unknown, the turmoil, the frustration. And likewise, the events of the film become more and more chaotic as it goes on. The fox is also seen consuming its own insides, which is an incredibly graphic image and can be connected to the self-destructive tendencies that can arise from depression, similar to those that are seen in Nymphomaniac. The deer is seen as similarly having lost its child, akin to that of the couple in the movie. It is very similar to them and represents a lot of what they feel. The deer represents the grief of the couple due to this loss and the sadness that comes with that. The crow is seen as undying, despite the attempts of he to get rid of it, the symbolic nature of despair and how it can seem unbreakable and unconquerable. This, again, further relates to one of the other films with melancholia and the feeling of hopelessness. The trio of animals all appearing together towards the end of the film is another important aspect of the symbolism of Antichrist. The aspects of pain, grief, and despair reach their peak in she, after the trio of animals appears, and it is this that truly ruins her mental state. She becomes incredibly violent as a result of this overwhelming depression, and this is the mental breaking point. It is symbolized in her violence at the end of the film. However, the three beggars set up an even bigger set of symbols that can be used when looking at the trilogy as a whole. The three beggars can easily represent the three films of the trilogy. The deer represents Antichrist, probably considered to be the most pure of animals in the trio, is ironically representing what most would consider to be the darkest and most disturbing of the trilogy. The deer has experienced the same loss, and its symbolic meaning of grief is one of the most common themes of Antichrist. The crow represents melancholia in its seemingly unavoidable representation of despair, the aspect of despair and hopelessness that is the central focus of Melancholia's commentary on depression. And finally, the fox represents the nymphomaniac. The fox is seen as self-consuming and in pain, and it is clear from watching the nymphomaniac that Jo's self-destructive tendencies cause her pain throughout the course of her life. Antichrist is definitely the most subjective of the three, and the symbolism in the movie could mean a wide range of different things. It could be taken at face value as seemingly meaningless, sad, and disturbing film. That is not how I choose to view it, though. I think Antichrist stands slightly above the other two in the trilogy, in my personal opinion, because it deals with the most aspects of depression while having a vast amount of potential interpretation to draw from. The symbolism in the second film, Melancholia, is still very heavy, but far more understandable and clear, at least to me. The most obvious symbol is that of the impending doom of the earth. This is meant to mirror the feeling that Justine feels throughout the course of the film. The world is, as Justine feels, to be normally. She feels a complete, overwhelming sense of hopelessness, and this is mirrored by the inevitable doom of the planet. The world is now made to feel as she feels constantly with her illness, which is what the main symbolic takeaway of Melancholia is. Von Trier wants the viewer to be able to connect these two parallels so that they can better understand the emotions and thoughts that Justine is experiencing. The symbolism in Melancholia does have more to it than that, though. The opening scene, as discussed in episode 2, is a representation of the events of the rest of the film. The audience now has an idea of everything that is about to happen, and yet they will still be impacted by what is shown on screen. The decision to do this, in my opinion, comes from the desire to show that even with precognition and a vague understanding of what is to come, one can still be affected by sadness or depression. Oftentimes, when someone has a plan or a guess of how events will play out, uh, they are positively impacted because they're presumed to have a degree of control over the path of their life. Similarly, Justine seems at first to be going in a positive direction with a hopeful future of being married and a new family. Yet she is still a victim of depression. Another big symbol that I noticed in the film is the contrast between the moon and the planet of Melancholia. This comes in the form of a few shots in which the moon and Melancholia are framed together, as well as shots of the planet alone. To me, the moon often symbolizes hope of progression or hope of the future. I think the shots of the moon and Melancholia are meant to show that while the events of life can stay constant, depression can still increase and become greater. The moon is shown as a singular size when compared to Melancholia, but as the film goes on, Melancholia for the most part grows. This symbolizes the overtaking of hope with despair, and that even if something seems to be going well in someone's life, depression can still take over. Depression is incredibly strong in its impact on people and can often dwarf feelings of happiness or hopefulness towards the future. This is why I think that while it might be one of the smaller details of the film, it is very important when analyzing what Von Trier is communicating. And I think that the moon and planet symbolism are really, really big. The film shows through various methods that anyone at any time can be affected by depression and can be affected immensely by it. The symbolism in the third film, Nymphomaniac, is slightly harder to analyze as it is presented with a far less fantastical approach than the prior two films. The film is presented in a way that many of its messages are clearly stated throughout the conversations between Joe and Seligman. The symbolism is more direct, as both characters consistently make analogies to the situations being discussed. The analogy-heavy dialogue seems to make the conversations more relatable, while also directly explaining to the audience the aspects of the film that Von Trier is showing, without coming across as heavy-handed or forced. There are analogies such as comparisons between fly fishing and how Joe seeks out companions in one of her stories. There's also a large amount of discussion about art and mathematics, with the primary focus being on the recurrence of the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio. The mentioning of this multiple times can be understood as one of the less direct aspects of symbolism in the film that is still very in your face. In the Fibonacci sequence, the previous number is added to create the next one, and on and on and on. In a similar way, the story of the film is essentially a compounding story of the combined actions and decisions of Joe. Well, not directly the same, I believe that this is what Von Trier is trying to get across. In a different way, I think the golden ratio discussion is more linked to Von Trier's commentary on subjectivity. The golden ratio is associated with the ideal and the perfect in all forms, whether art, architecture, nature, or really anything that is formed by the ratio. I think that to Von Trier, this is somewhat absurd, but also beautiful. He acknowledges the beauty created by such a ratio, but I think he is adding that there exists other forms of perfection. He is saying that despite the uncharacteristic nature of Joe's life, it does not make it any less beautiful than that of someone else. Although this might not be how the viewer perceives her, I believe it is how Von Trier perceives the character of Joe. Perhaps the most important aspect of symbolism in the film is the nature of the character of Seligman and his name. The name Seligman was likely chosen by Von Trier based on the famous psychologist Martin Seligman, who is credited as the founder of the theory of positive psychology. This psychology is based on establishing positive thoughts and connotations with a person with depression to help encourage a sense of purpose from my understanding of the method. The reason that this is important as the aspect, for the most part, describes the character of Seligman. He, throughout the film, is trying to convince Joe that she is not an evil person. She should believe in herself. He praises her positive traits and compliments the aspects of her story that she does well. He doesn't ignore the destructive elements of Joe's story, but decides instead to focus on the positive. The link between the name of Seligman and the theme of the movie are very clear, with little research, and it was a small but smart addition by Von Trier in the film. And I think it adds a lot to what he's trying to get across. Along with this, I believe that although maybe not entirely symbolic, the sexual escapades of Joe can be understood as potentially her lashing out at herself. She even eventually becomes involved with a sadist, which is only further to perpetuate this idea that she's trying to punish herself for her actions. She seems callous at some points, but I think she is more sympathetic than she appears at first. She is a damaged person, and her actions show this both literally and symbolically. Because Joe is meant to be someone that we care about, that we feel for, and we understand her pain throughout the course of the film. I think that the symbolism is something that could be an easy oversight to the majority of people who view the three films, and that's okay. You don't need to appreciate the symbolism of a movie to understand it. It's stupid to say that someone who doesn't understand a movie is dumb, or they don't get it, or something like that, or that you can't enjoy the movie if you don't get it. While I do think that understanding the symbolism is important, it's not essential. But especially with films like this, of films like this type, it helps add a lot more to the depth of the film. And I think that it helps you get a lot more out of it. Some people say that a film isn't good if you have to think about it or do more research about it or have to figure out what it's about. And I wholeheartedly disagree. I think that symbolism is such a magical and amazing thing that can do so much to increase the impact of a movie. And it makes it interesting because you're not thinking about the movie just when it's happening. You're thinking about it after the credits have finished. It continues on into your thinking and your thought process, and it leaves more of an impact. And I think that that's something that's so powerful about symbolism. The majority of people, I don't think they're going to appreciate the symbolism in this movie because it's easy to dismiss it because of the content. But I do think that many people refuse to admit that offensive and provocative films such as these could have anything greater than a surface level story. And symbolism is one of the reasons why these movies are as good as they are. I think it's wrong, honestly, to immediately dismiss the films because of their subject matter. The films are about so much more than a disturbed couple, an impending apocalypse, and a sex addict. The films, to me, are rich with content that can be debated and analyzed. And while these are only my interpretations of the film, I know there are a vast number of potential alternatives and understandings of these three films. There's so much that you can dive into, with elements of the Garden of Eden in Antichrist, with elements of other sci-fi films within Melancholia, and within elements of romance and stuff like that within Infomaniac. There's so much to talk about. But these are the elements of symbolism I wanted to focus on because I feel like these are really important ones when trying to understand the film and getting the most out of the movie and the message that you can, and kind of showing how much thought was put into them. And part of the reason I really like the movies. So that's my discussion on some of the major symbolic elements of the three films. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'm looking forward to making episode 5. Thank you.